All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from folks joining in from various parts of the world here. We're going to give about 30 seconds for people to keep joining the room, and then we'll get started. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. This is JW here, the go-to-market manager with Entitle. Thanks for joining us today. We're expecting this event runtime to be roughly about 20 minutes or so, and very excited about the material we have for you today. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into it. A few rules of the road. Please use the Q&A area for questions to the speakers. You'll find that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, along with all the other buttons on your Zoom bar. There also is a chat button you can use to raise any technical issues over the course of the event. And we'll go ahead and get that recording and the deck for this event sent out to everyone afterwards. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker of the day, Roy. Rohit, or Roy, as he is more popularly known as, is the head of customer success here at Entitle and takes care of our EU business. Roy has spent 2 decades in technology and the industrial automation space at companies like Schneider Electric, Thales, and was also the founder and CEO of Mashik, which is a technology provider for the aftermarket prior to his time joining Entitle now. So with that, Roy, I will hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you, JW. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your interest in the topic. Let's get right to it. So we're here to talk about bill of materials. And just to kind of rewind and make sure that they're all on the same page, a bill of materials is simply a list of parts, components, subcomponents that built a machine, right? And usually the bill of materials, the information that is managed typically has 3 or 4 information about the part that is important. The first is what machine it belongs in. Then, of course, a part number for whether it's a machine builder or an end customer who has it. There is a part number with a small description that kind of describes what it is. And depending on its usage, it could have additional information like where in the machine it is installed in, as well as how many pieces or what quantity of the parts are in the bill of material, in the equipment, right? So that's pretty much what a bill of materials is. And why is this important in the context of the aftermarket? Now, before I get there, let's talk of the different kinds of bill of materials. You have what is called an engineering BOM, and this is usually built by and managed by the engineering team, that the R&D team that basically designed the equipment. And they scout the different suppliers, they specify what the parts should be doing. And once they have procured these parts, they kind of build this bill of materials for the equipment that they have built. And alongside 3D diagrams, engineering drawings with wiring diagrams and so on, this kind of information is usually maintained in a PLM system that is used by the engineering team. So that's the first kind. Then you have a second kind, which is more of a service catalog. Now, this is a subset of the engineering bill of materials in some ways. And its primary purpose is to sell aftermarket parts. So it's used either internally by the order desk or the service team, and sometimes even by the customers themselves in order to be able to transact parts, right? Now, the important thing and where it is somehow different is the engineering team, once they've built the machine, they've kind of shipped it away and they don't need to worry about it that much other than when they're starting to design the next version of the equipment. Whereas the service team is kind of responsible to their customers to ensure that the machine can be operated for a long period of time. And sometimes this can be 20 years, sometimes 30 years. And over this period of time, the machine builder typically changes suppliers, changes parts, and therefore the old parts become obsolescent and obsolete rather, and then they get replaced with new part numbers. So all of this information should be managed in a service catalog or in a service BOM. And this is usually used by different sales teams. They may decide that different subsets of this, the engineering BOM is what they would sell commercially in a particular country that they are selling in. And that could depend on whether it makes sense from a pricing perspective to sell those parts if it is available in a particular geographic location, so that it's available fast enough for them to sell it. So this service catalog could be different in different different parts of the company, even for the same family of equipment. Then there is a third one, and this is special because I call this the as-is equipment, or the as-is BOM. And typically, when you have equipment that go with some kind of a service contract, and it is the supplier who is responsible for its operation over time. It could also be in the pay-as-you-go or the pay-as-you-use models as well. Here, there is an interest in managing not just what parts went into the equipment when it was built, but also what parts are currently operated on the equipment, as and when the parts get changed, as and when service and repairs happen. So you kind of manage the history of the changes of parts and interventions in terms of repairs and refurbishments on the equipment over the lifetime of the equipment. Now, when you think of bill of materials, and I think it's quite clear that you would want to manage that to sell parts. Why is it interesting to actually manage your BOMs, and especially your service BOMs? And a lot of companies talk of wanting to do a parts cleanup, or wanting to have a better way to manage their spare parts as it pertains to selling. Now, why is that important? Here's a typical example. So, and I think if you're in the service side of the business in an engineering or a machine building company, you can relate to this a lot. Typically, a customer calls and your order desk personnel answers the call. And it starts with, "Who are you, Mr. Customer? What's your customer number?" "Okay, now I have you. What equipment are you calling about? Give me your serial number." Now, once they have the serial number, they have to dig in to a large file repository to find a PDF where there is, along with the engineering drawings, all of the different parts that are in that equipment. And when they find the specific part that the customer is calling about, they have a part number. And they still aren't certain whether this part is still commercialized, or if it has become obsolete and there is a new part number that has replaced it. So they have to dig into that part number in the ERP system then, and then find the right part number, and find the current part number if it is the original part number is obsolete. And by the time they go through a few lines of parts that the customer wants to order, it's usually at least half an hour. And sometimes it can be 2 hours, depending on how complicated it is. And this is simply just to identify what parts the customer wants a quote for, right? And by the time the entire quotation process is complete, it usually takes a company 1 day, sometimes 2 days. And most people think this is okay. It is satisfactory because they believe that's the best they can do. But what that is actually doing is that it is limiting the number of order lines that each order desk personnel can process. It is limiting the number of customers that a machine builder can transact with. And because it is simply not possible to do more transactions without drastically scaling up the order desk organization, which understandably most companies don't want to do beyond a point, it limits the amount of spare part revenue that a machine building company can basically extract from its install base. And some people are happy with it. Other people want to scale this up further. And there is a smart way, in fact, to go about your spare parts business and the service bill of materials to make sure that you can actually drastically scale up your aftermarket and spare part revenue without having to do the same on your order desk side, especially in today's environment where labor is hard to find, skilled people are at a premium. You want to be able to automate a ton of things that can be automated. And that's kind of why this topic is relevant for the aftermarket. Let me go further. So when you get started with a spare parts cleanup or a parts data management project, I think it is very tempting to take the entire list of a few 100,000 parts that are probably in the universal library of parts that you've ever purchased and installed into an equipment and say, let's clean up all of this. And that usually tends to be a very long project that may never see the day of light. And it doesn't have to be that way if you're going to really prioritize where you should actually focus your efforts. And in order to do that, it might be interesting to look at the parts from a different perspective, and the bill of materials from a different perspective as well. So you have typically three kinds of parts, and I love to call them in this way. You have the wear parts, you have the spare parts, and you have the rare parts. Now, wear parts are pretty simple. It's like a tire of a car, directly tied to the amount of operating hours of the equipment. You have to change certain parts after a certain number of operation cycles. These are high volume parts. Usually the competition on this is high, and it's usually the winner of the deal is usually the one who prices best, and the delivery lead times are acceptably short for the customers. So in this case, having the right part numbers at all times is going to be critical, because this is where a ton of the business actually comes from, and speed matters, right? Then comes another part, and I like to compare this to the headlight lamps of a car. So everybody knows that they fail at some point of time. It's not really tied to usage, although that does have an impact. But it's one of those things where you can't exactly predict when it becomes necessary. So you need to have stocks, right? So these are relatively high margin, more medium volume, and this has a relatively low competition because the understanding of the equipment that is required to determine what part is compatible is relatively high. Is at least not ignorable, right? So here you have some time. So this would be the next set of parts that you'd want to target in your parts cleanup. So if you can actually categorize your equipment's parts into rare parts and spare parts, my recommendation is to simply focus on these two, because these are the only two that have a commercial consequence for a parts cleanup. And then there is a third one, which is interesting, and it is a bulk of the parts that, in fact, companies are faced with when they look at their BOMs from a more holistic perspective. But these are the parts that I'd recommend never having to bother, because these are like the engine of the car or the motor in the car, or one of those structural things that are not actually, you don't actually anticipate failure. And even when they do fail, it's usually because of something that the customer did, which he or she isn't supposed to do, like an accident or a misuse. And then usually when they do fail, the customer's acceptance of a long lead time for the part to be delivered, sometimes it has to be even fabricated, is fine. So, and this is a completely captive market. So you have the time to fix this, at least much more time to fix this than the other two categories, right? So I would say if you do have to tackle parts, tackle these the last. And that's, with that advice, I'd kind of move over to how you can actually compress that 30-minute call that I spoke about in the beginning into just 2 minutes. And just having the parts list is the first step. You can't do anything without it. But then once you have it, the best way to go about it is to actually tie it to the customer and the customer's specific equipment with the serial number. So that if you can actually have a customer who calls, and the moment you've discovered it is specific sunwear, and the moment you've identified that the customer wants a part for M539447, if you can actually not only see the full list of parts, but also see, for example, that a specific part is obsolete and what's the new number that's replaced it, the conversation is much shorter. The customer is much more satisfied. And typically, one of the benefits of having this at the time of conversation is this. Sometimes you ask the customer to place an order for 693033. And then you've done the analysis after the order comes in, and then you send them Z8, whatever this part number is here. Sometimes they wonder if they've received the right part or you've sent them the wrong part by mistake. And there is, again, another back and forth. Sometimes there can be returns because the customer doesn't have this process of verifying with you, and they say it's the wrong part number, I did not order this. And these kind of conversations can be cut short by just having this information when you are actually discussing with the customer. It's something that we've now actually built into Entitle's Insights platform. So if you're actually using it today, speak with your customer success manager. This can actually be rolled out pretty quickly in your organization if you have the data ready. And if you don't have the data ready and you're just getting started on your parts cleanup exercise, here's some best practices that I'd like to share with you based on the years that I've actually done this with different customers. So the first one I'd say is separate the service BOM from the engineering BOM, because typically I've seen companies, very large ones even, where there is no separation, and then they have obviously trouble giving access to the engineering systems to their service people in the countries, for them to be able to refer to the part numbers. And you have license related issues, you have IP related issues, and this simply means that the service teams spend a whole lot of time waiting for the people in the headquarters to come back to them with information, and that's completely avoidable. So if you can actually just separate the two and have the service teams maintain a service BOM, makes their jobs and your jobs much easier. The second thing I'd say is to look at the difference between having one service BOM globally and then giving flexibility for each of the sales teams to manage it themselves. Because there is, like I said earlier, the question of whether to sell or not, because sometimes you're not competitive in a particular market. And the other is from a logistics perspective as well. It's one more area where it makes sense for each team to decide what part of the service BOM they want to commercialize in their customer, or to their customer base. So that's something else I'd say. Then you have part numbers across different business units and different regions. And I know there is sometimes a method in that madness. We know that sometimes BUs compete with each other for spare parts. We know that sometimes customers also take advantage of having different parts of the business that they're talking to kind of get a best deal. And it also makes sense to have really complex pricing logics on parts where you sell a certain part at X to one kind of customers, and in another customer segment, you want to sell it at a much higher price. But the answer to that is not by having different part numbers with different prices. It's actually to have the same part number with different prices. That's an opinion. I give you that. But it's much simpler to handle it that way, especially from the complexity of the supply chain. And that's something that I would recommend to harmonize part numbers for sure. The last thing I'd say is, and this is take it for what it is. I think a lot of you lived through, like I did as well, the supply chain problems that came in during COVID. And we had a lot of our customers that would call and say, I need these parts, but we wouldn't have it in stock. And sometimes the situation would have been so critical that it would have made sense to just tell the customer that this is a Siemens part and here's the part number, just go order it. And while that might have lost business then, I'm sure that it kind of gained the loyalty of the customer later on. So it's a hard one, that one. But if you can at least give it to your service teams, the original OEM and the original part number, and let them judge how it impacts the business, that's another way that you can go forward. So that's two other information I'd recommend adding as you manage and clean up your parts to build your service BOMs. And with that, I finish my seminar, my webinar, and I open it up for questions.
Roy, thank you for that great material. Appreciate you putting this together for us. Did have a couple questions for you. First one is, you recommended to share OEM name and part number with regional sales teams. Isn't this a little bit risky?
Yeah, it is. And you have to take it for the risk. And I don't think it makes sense to do that systematically with every service organization. But especially if you have service teams that are working with strategic customers, large accounts, the demand is already there from these customers in many cases. But even if it is not, sometimes the relationship is so critical and the downtime for some of these equipment can be so expensive for the customer and therefore for the OEM, that empowering the service team with that information could help them basically cut that short. So it's a case-by-case decision to be made. That said, if you don't have it in a place where it is easy to have that case-by-case decision, you're basically stuck. So that's kind of, it's a two-edged sword. Let's just put it that way. So it has to be handled carefully.
Excellent, thank you. And one more, which is a little bit of a longer question, so let me get through it here for you. Having the same part number across business units and countries gets resistant because it makes it easier for some customers who contact different sales teams in different countries to get the best price for parts. What can you say about this?
I've actually seen that, and you're right. You have some smart customers that do that, but here's the point, right? wouldn't you rather they contact different parts of the same company to get the part than a competitor? So that's the first way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it is, by having different part numbers, you expect, and I think historically it's been true, you make the customer's job harder to do that. But most of this kind of behavior comes from much larger customers who actually have the stuff to do this kind of research themselves. And especially with what's come with ChatGPT, there are customers that are actually feeding this information into AI systems, and there are startups that are actually offering these kind of services that are helping the customer identify who are the likely OEMs for a given part and what would be the part number. And even if they don't have the part number, they start those conversations directly with the OEMs. If it is especially for automation parts and so on, that's already happening. So that said, I just think it's easier for companies from a process perspective to simplify that and make sure that each country is quoting the same price. So managing kind of global prices for given customers is perhaps a better approach than to potentially try to make it hard for the customer to do that, because there are smarter ways to get around this now that probably didn't exist before.
Awesome, Roy. Thank you. I don't have any other questions in the Q&A for now. So I think with that, folks, we're good to wrap up. Appreciate your time today. Roy, again, appreciate you putting this material together for us and presenting. And we will circulate this material to registrants after this event here. So thank you again for your time. Appreciate it. And we'll see you at the next event.
Yeah, I just had one other quick thing that I am offering for people who are attending. If
Sure.
you're at the start of the journey, if you're assessing a parts data cleanup project in 2024, feel free to reach out. You can scan this QR code and we'll be offering a 15-minute pre-assessment free of cost to kind of help you get started, consider the right metrics as you get started. So feel free to reach out, scan this QR code, and we'll be able to help you out with that. Yeah, so that's one thing. And if you have any further questions that come to mind on this presentation, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to answer more questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thanks. Didn't mean to cut you off ahead of time there, Roy. Appreciate it.
Great.
All righty, folks.
Then
Thank you all again for your time. We will see you at the next event. Cheers.